How are you this morning? Good morning, y'all. You're going to come in and find your seat. We'll go ahead and get started pretty quickly. As always, in the book of Luke, we've got a lot of ground to cover today. I hope there's somebody in your life that made you feel loved yesterday. If there's not, and that didn't happen, I hope you know that there's a congregation here that loves you very much and hopes that you know that. We're going to be in Luke chapter 20 this morning. Luke chapter 20, and we'll work from there. They're telling me they can't hear me. I'm going to turn. Is that better? Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Ken. We're going to be in Luke chapter 20. Luke chapter 20. Daily Bible readers, if you'll go ahead and raise your hand. I'm going to remind you while he's counting of a passage all the way back in Luke chapter 4. Luke chapter 4, beginning in verse 21, says, "And he began to say to them, 'Today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing.' And all were speaking well of him, and wondering at the gracious words which were falling from his lips." When you look at Jesus and his ministry, there was no teacher, no preacher, minister, or however you want to label it, there was none like Christ. People often label him the master teacher, and I think that is absolutely appropriate. It was said of Christ that no man speaks the way that this man speaks. And they wondered and marveled at the words which were coming from his lips. And I think as we get into Luke chapter 20, we can see why this is the case. Just a quick overview for you. Remember, Jesus is in Jerusalem now. He's made that triumphal entry. And the best way I've heard this described is he's going to take a stick and stick it right in the hornet's nest and stir it up. AKA he's going to look and to teach and to rebuke these religious leaders. And it's going to get to the point where they're going to put him on the cross. So we've got another chapter of teaching here in chapter 20. We see also the same in 21. And then in 22, the Passover is here. He's going to have that last meal with his apostles. Y'all are done. Sorry, I got distracted. Hope y'all feel like y'all got y'all's workout in this morning. He has that meal and then, of course, goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he'll then be met by Judas. He'll be arrested, tried, and then put on the cross. And so that's where we're going. But we'll start in chapter 20. Let's do verses 1 through 8. On one of the days, while he was teaching the people in the temple and preaching the gospel, this is right after he's cleansed the temple, so remember this, or this was a recent event. The chief priests and the scribes and the elders confronted him, and they spoke to him, saying, "Tell us by what authority you are doing these things, or who is the one who gave you this authority?" Jesus answered and said to them, "I will also ask you a question, and you will tell me. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from men?" And they reasoned among themselves, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say, 'Why did you not believe him?' But if we say from men, all the people will stone us to death, for they are convinced that John was a prophet." So they answered that they did not know where it came from. And Jesus said to them, "Well, then, nor will I tell you by what authority I do these things." Any observations from these first 8 verses? I'll ask you what you think before I tell you what I think. Any observations here?
He's pointing out that he's showing the references to the world and to heaven, and which one will you live in, and which one do you believe, what the world tells you or what heaven is going to be.
So there's two categories in which the teaching could fall into. Is it from God or is it from man? Sure. Right. We're going to see in a moment that the religious leaders pretend to do something, and it blows my mind that they're having to pretend to do this. We'll see that in a minute. But sure, nothing to do with truth. Notice that this question is the one that is the foundation, of all of our conversations. It's authority. That's what they wanted to know, is authority. And we know that their intentions in that were not genuine. Because I think you could make a case that they already knew where Christ got this authority from. They just didn't want to accept it. Sure. Anything else? Why did Jesus respond with a question? And he does this hundreds of times in his ministry. Right. Why did he do that?
I think he puts them in a horn, some of them dilemma, where either answer that they pick, they're not really pleased to pick that, and so it makes them reevaluate their position.
Sure. It makes, yeah, exactly. I couldn't say it better than that. Sure.
I think a lot of it is he's sort of managing the timeline. He's going to be tried and convicted when it's time to be tried and convicted. So if it's not time yet, he's going to show them that they're out of their league, that they cannot outthink him or outdebate him.
Sure. He's working, and eventually, when Christ is ready to go to the cross, that's going to take place, and he willingly laid his life down. Going back to what Brother Hafner said, it made them evaluate their position. And so by asking a question and making them answer it, they're going to have to take a stance on what they believe. And as we see in this passage, the two stances that they want to take do not end well for them. If they say it's from heaven, well, we didn't believe that. So why aren't you following commands from the God that you say you follow so closely and devotedly? If you say from man, you've got all of these people with honest hearts who are seeing John and those teachings for what they were and are prepared to stone them for those actions. So Jesus here, once again, using questions to teach. So I think about personal application. This is a great way to study with people. Ask questions and make them answer them for themselves. Yes, sir. Right. Exactly. And so they tried to trap Jesus, and they were the ones that ended up getting trapped in the first place. And that's going to happen again in this chapter multiple times. Okay. Let's keep moving on here. Verse number 9. And he began to tell them this parable. A man planted a vineyard and rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey for a long time. At the harvest time, he sent a slave to the vine growers so that they would give him some of the produce of the vineyard. But the vine growers beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he proceeded to send another slave, and they beat him also, and treated him shamefully, and sent him away empty-handed. And he proceeded to send out a third, and this one they also wounded and cast out. The owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the vinegrowers saw him, they reasoned with one another, saying, "This is the heir. Let us kill him, so that the inheritance will be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy these vine growers and will give the vineyard to others. And when they heard it, they said, "May it never be." Observations from this parable. I think it's really interesting that as Jesus was telling this parable, there really weren't a lot of questions as to what it meant and who it applied to. As we continue to read through this chapter, as you'll note, verse number 19 as well, they knew that Jesus was talking about them in a very negative way. Because this is going to, you see, and fuel this rage. They were ready to kill him, but because of the people, they weren't able to. And so then, as we begin to interpret this parable, the picture seems clear. God, as the owner of this vineyard, that perhaps his people, the Jews, these religious leaders, being these vine growers, and he sends slave or servant after servant after servant, and each time they're rejected. It makes me think about people like the prophets, those who were sent to God's people over and over and over again to try to instruct them, to point them in the right direction, to tell them what God would want for them, and yet they rejected him. And so ultimately, what does he do? He sends his son. And what did they do with his son? What did they do with Jesus Christ? They killed him. And so even in this, perhaps, maybe seeing some foreshadowing to what is to come. Any other observations? Verse number 17. But when Jesus looked at them and said, "What then is this that is written? The stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, but on whomever it falls, it will scatter him like dust." So you could cross-reference here Psalm 118, verse number 22. I would also encourage you to write down next to that 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 and following for a little bit more New Testament commentary on what Christ is perhaps saying there. Verse number 18, this idea of Jesus is this stone that some are perhaps going to stumble or be crushed by him and the teaching and the truth that he is bringing to the world. Okay. Now in verse number 20 and following, we're going to see two interactions here. We actually see them in Matthew as well. And these interactions are very much like we see in verses 1 through 8. But notice verse 20 first. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be righteous. Does anybody have a different word than pretended there? Pretended? Vain? Vain? Feign. Okay. That I have no idea I've never heard that word before. Interesting. King James, yes sir. Yes sir. Okay. So the word is that. It is to be a pretender. It's so interesting to me that these people are pretending to be righteous. When I think about these undercover schemes, undercover cops, people that are trying to spy on, do a sting or a bust, it's always that they're trying to be someone bad or someone that breaks the law or a criminal, all of these things. And yet in this passage, the people that are supposed to be the leaders of God's people and really be an example to his people are pretending to be righteous, which implies what? They're not righteous. And so we already see this laying this foundation for the intentions in which, once again, they're going to question Jesus. Let's keep reading. In verse 20, in order that they might catch him in some statement, so that they could deliver him to the rule and the authority of the governor. They questioned him, saying, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach correctly. You are not partial to any, but teach the way of God in truth." So, our kids have a word for this today. I'm around kids, so This is Gen Z slang for you. They call it glazing. So essentially, you are talking somebody up either for a relationship or people with kids are smiling at me right now. I can see it. Basically, trying to butter somebody up. Maybe that's how you've heard it said before. So there's no genuineness here at all. There's a very specific intention that these people have. So here's the question, verse number 22. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? The reason I bring up Matthew's account, this is Matthew 22, beginning in verse 15. Matthew gives us some details that might be helpful. There's two groups here. The disciples of the Pharisees, and then also we have the Herodians. So what's interesting about these groups, Herodians, they were more in line with the government. They supported Herod. They had positions in that regard, and the Pharisees were very much anti anything government. They were separate in that way. So we've got two groups that really don't want anything to do with each other. Their beliefs, their systems, they're different. And yet they're united in trying to trip up Christ. And so if Jesus was to maybe take the side of the Pharisees and say, no, don't pay taxes. I shouldn't have to do that. Perhaps upsetting the Herodians who supported the government. But then if Jesus was to say, absolutely, you need to pay your taxes, then perhaps upsetting the Pharisees who had nothing to do with government. But what does Christ do in verse number 23 and 24? He detected their trickery, so Christ knew the hearts of men, and he said to them, show me a denarius, whose likeness and inscription does it have? And they said, Caesar's. So once again, he takes a question and he asks another question. And then the teaching comes in verse number 25, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. It's so interesting because you have these two groups that are very opinionated in both areas of both, government and not government, and yet Christ says, give to Caesar what is Caesar. So absolutely there's a submission to government, but then ultimately remember that we give to God the things that are God's. When it comes back to the authority question, which if they were listening, he just answered it again. God is over all, and ultimate submission comes to him, but then also there's a duty, a responsibility to submit to local government. And of course, the caveat there, if the government asks us to do something that goes against the will of God, that's when we would choose to submit to God rather than our own government. Okay, does that make sense? Any observations there? Okay, let's keep rolling. Verse number 27. Now there came to some of the Sadducees who say there is no resurrection. And they questioned him, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies having a wife and he is childless, then his brother should marry the wife and raise up children to his brother. Now there were 7 brothers, and the first took a wife and died childless, and the second, and then the third married her, and in the same way all 7 died, leaving no children. Finally, the woman died also. In the resurrection, therefore, which one's wife will she be? For all 7 married her. Why did the Sadducees bring up this situation? That seems really confusing. To trick him, because they didn't believe in the resurrection. So they're trying to prove a point with the question that in the scenario that they're bringing up. So of course Jesus is going to answer them, and it's interesting here because he doesn't start with a question. Jesus said to them, this is verse number 34, the sons of this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy to attain to that age and the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. For they cannot die, it cannot even die anymore because they are like angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. But that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the passage about the burning bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him. So what does Christ do here? He debunks this argument, very, very quickly, very simply. One, there's no marriage in the life to come. So doesn't matter if there were 7, 12, doesn't matter because there's no marriage. So that debunks, it doesn't matter how many, the marriage system there because there will be no marriage in heaven. But then he brings up a really interesting point all the way back to Moses and the burning bush. Why does he bring up Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham? What's the argument that Christ is making here? Sure. So he's appealing to an audience, and it's interesting because the Sadducees really only took the first 5 books. So Jesus is going to prove that the resurrection and this life after death does exist with the few books that they accept to be true. Sure. So he brings up these names so that he's got their attention, but why? What's the point?
He's saying that he is the God of Abraham. He is, not he was. And so that proves that they still exist somewhere. So they only believed in the first 5 books, the Torah, and they took a very literal approach to that. But you wonder why didn't they believe in the resurrection? Well, read the first 5 books. There's not a lot about
Right.
resurrection in those first 5 books.
Sure.
And so from their viewpoint, yeah, it doesn't talk about resurrection. It doesn't talk about an afterlife. And so they didn't believe in that. So here Jesus is able to show, no, because of the language that is used, that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's present tense.
Sure. So the first 5 books, Old Testament, there's not a lot about the resurrection. And so you wonder where that stance comes from. That's why they took those books, took them literally. But Christ even showing there that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, implying that they still exist even though they've died on this earth, implying that there is life after death. So debunks these arguments, and as you continue to walk through, the answer in verse number 39 is, "Teacher, you have spoken well." And it's interesting in verse number 40, it seems like maybe they finally learned their lesson. They did not have the courage to question him any longer about anything. So they're quiet after this conversation, and Jesus takes advantage of it. Verse 41, Jesus now back with a question of his own. Then he said to them, "How is it that they say Christ is David's son? For David says himself in the book of Psalms, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet.' Therefore David calls him Lord, and how is he his son?" And while all the people were listening, he said to his disciples, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love respectful greetings in the marketplace and the chief seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets, who devour widows' houses and for appearance sake offer long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation." So it's interesting in all these questions, he finally turns to, once again, his lordship. And he's trying to get them to understand with David and what he was saying, it was not that the Christ was going to be the literal son of David, but was going to come from his bloodline. And that's exactly what he does. And once again, takes the stick, if you can imagine that, and right into the nest. And condemns them again for their hypocrisy and the things that they are doing as we wrap up this chapter. Any observations, questions about chapter 20? Yes, ma'am.
One of the things I noticed was that when they said that what was Caesar's, and what was the Lord was Lord's. All right, I think that
okay? I'm not sure if the Jews wanted Caesar as their king. I think I'd argue they probably didn't. But a good observation in the sense of they're trying to get him to think about who's in charge right now and whether they were to respect that man or not. So I think that would be an observation there. Chapter 21 now. You can put this chapter, if you like to keep a list of difficult passages, this chapter is one of them. And you compare it with its brother in Luke 16 and also in Matthew chapter 24. We'll look at the widow's gift here, the mites, the copper coins, depending on your version, and then I'll give you some observations concerning this difficult chapter. And he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury, and he saw a poor widow putting in 2 small copper coins. And he said to them, "Truly I say to you, this widow put in more than all of them, for they all out of their surplus put into the offering, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had to live on." I read something this morning that I've never read before, and I thought it was really interesting. I'm going to have to look at it more, but I'm giving it to you for your consideration. One author wrote that this copper coin would have been about 1/5 of the American penny in value. So these 2 coins together would not have even equaled 1 American penny. So you think about how little in the amount that she gave, and yet how much Christ considers what she had given in relation to what I'm sure these rich religious leaders were throwing into the whatever, the word's not coming to my mind right now. The place where they would put the money. That's what we'll go with. Excuse that. Okay. It's interesting to me because when you look at giving as a whole in the Bible, it seems to me that there's a lot more of an emphasis on the percentage than the actual amount that is given. So now we look at the Old Testament, we see they were giving, we call it tithing. They were giving, roughly 10% of everything that they own, their food, their livestock, their fields. There was an abundant, a percentage of everything that they had, the best of everything that they had, that went to the Lord. Now that's where I insert, we look at the New Testament, there's no direct command to give 10% of everything that you have. Okay, that's an Old Testament, we don't tithe in the New Testament. But it's interesting when you think about purposing in your heart to give, 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse number 7, how we do that. When we give, and I think we see great principles in the Old Testament, are we giving based on an amount that's comfortable for us, or is it more of, is it a percentage of everything that I make? So I heard a man make this argument before. I'm just throwing it out there for your consideration. Saying, you decide I'm going to give $400 a month to the church. And you decide to do that, from whenever you start giving until the day that you die, you're giving $400. And maybe that goes up a little bit in your giving. How much thought and preparation do you put in that versus the person that says, I'm going to give, just throwing a number out here, 13% of everything that I make. How much more preparation does it take for us to look at everything that we bring in financially, sit down and say, this percentage of it belongs to the Lord before I fill out the rest of my budget? And so, just something for your consideration. I know that, I read what the widow had done and think to myself, there's absolutely more that I could be giving. And we can have this conversation about money, but there, we can give in other ways as well. Just something for your consideration. Any thoughts, observations about that? Yes, ma'am. Right. Absolutely.
I think Jesus is trying to pull them from the physical, from the fear of men, and help them see it in a God who lives. What's the intention?
Sure.
And if we're taking the intention to serve God and please Him, those things look very different than when we're just looking at a calculation and not following it.
Sure. So there's heart, there's motivation, and really probably emphasis placed there. And when those things are there, other things follow the way that they should. Absolutely. I know where I'm at right now that I need to work on maybe perhaps my faith in giving in poverty compared to what this, because this is all that she owned. And so we need to ask ourselves, once again, thinking back to the rich young ruler again, are we being stewards of things like this, or are we striving for earthly wealth and riches? The Bible says so much about money, and this is becoming something I said I wasn't going to spend a lot of time on this. We're about to move on. But so much about money. One of every 2 parables that Jesus talks about deals with money in some way. And we are so blessed financially here in America in comparison to the world right now, in comparison to history of mankind. How are we using those funds? Okay, now we're going to move on. We talked in Luke 17 about 80-70, and when I say 80-70, I'm referring to when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, and also the second coming of Christ. So passages that I mentioned earlier there, Luke 17, also Matthew chapter 24. These passages are extremely difficult to work through because when you're reading through them, there's some passages you're like, this is absolutely talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. I've got no doubt in my mind. And then you'll read a couple passages later and you're like, okay, this sounds a lot more like the judgment day and the second coming of Christ. My Bible heading, beginning in verse number 25, heads that section as the return of Christ. Maybe yours does as well. Headings are great, but they're not inspired, and I think this morning perhaps is one of those cases to see that. So, verse number 5, this whole point, while they're sitting in the temple, some were talking about the temple, that it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts. And he said, as for these things which you are looking at, the days will come which there will not be left one stone upon another, which will not be torn down. So when I'm reading that, I see they're in the temple, they're talking, and Jesus is saying not one stone is going to stand on top of another. And so mine instantly goes to 80-70. It's interesting, too, just for your consideration, if you've ever looked at the temple, some of those stones weighed thousands of pounds. And they do not stand on top of one another. That absolutely came to fruition. Okay, so in verse 7 all the way through verse 33, Jesus is going to give some signs in relation to this context about the temple being destroyed. So as we read through this, I'm probably going to note some of these. Okay, verse number 7, they questioned him, saying, when therefore will these things happen? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? And he said, see to it that you are not misled, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is near. Do not go after them. So false messiahs would be a sign according to verse number 8. When you hear of wars and disturbances, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end does not follow immediately. Then he continued by saying to them, nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. So another sign here, there's war and there's disorder. Verse 11, and there will be great earthquakes, and in various places plagues and famine, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. So natural disturbances, another sign, verse number 11. But before all of these things, they will lay hands on you and will persecute you, delivering you to the synagogues and prisons, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. It will lead to an opportunity for your testimony. So make up your minds not to prepare beforehand to defend yourselves, for I will give you utterance and wisdom which none of your opponents will be able to resist or refute. But you will be betrayed by parents and brothers and relatives, and they will put some of you to death, and you will be hated by all because of my name. Yet not a hair of your head will perish, but by your endurance you will gain your lives. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. So verses 12 through 19, I see a picture here, a sign of extreme persecution. And you look in verse number 16, if you want to add another to that list, betrayal from even your own family and relatives is part of that. Verse number 20 looks like the beginning of a picture of this Roman siege. Here's a couple numbers for you from Josephus. 1.1 million Jews died during the destruction of Jerusalem. Another 79,000 carried away into captivity. So this absolutely was no small feat. There was a lot of death, destruction, and pain, sorrow, all of those things involved in this event in history. Then there's a warning beginning in verse number 21. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of her city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city, because these are days of vengeance, so that all the things that are written will be fulfilled. Woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the time that the Gentiles are fulfilled. So a warning to specific groups. Perhaps here you think about those who are pregnant or nursing babies, how that might be harder for them to get away, to flee in such a chaotic and terrible time. Once again, picturing this destruction of Jerusalem. Now, in verse number 25, this is where I really start to wrestle with this text. There will be signs in the sun and moon and stars, and on the earth dismay among the nations, in perplexity at the roaring of the sea and the waves, men fainting from fear and the expectation of things which are coming upon the world, for the powers of heaven will be shaken. Now, when you look at these two verses, it absolutely screams judgment. But if you look at the book of Isaiah, you look at a passage like Ezekiel chapter 32, verses 7 and 8. If you look at a passage like Joel chapter 2, language like this is used not just in describing the end of the world, but also destruction of cities and or nations. So here, we got to keep reading because it's not quite clear. Verse number 27 is perhaps the verse that gets me more than any of them. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with great power and glory. So I think this is the passage why they label this the return of Christ. And I tell you that I have read good brethren and their writings on this passage, and there's some disagreement here. But it's interesting because in verse number 32, now skipping down in this parable that Jesus is telling them, same context, he says, "This generation will not pass away until all of these things take place." So because Christ is not returned yet, I don't think that's what this context is talking about. You see this picture in verse number 27. If you keep it in the context with the language that's being used here to point to something maybe not as literal, this picture in verse number 27 could just simply be a picture of God's judgment against Jerusalem. Okay. That was a lot really quickly. Any questions about that?
Yeah, is this a foreshadow of pre-trib or post-trib?
Sorry?
Is this a foreshadow of the pre-trib or post-trib?
So we're looking here is this the destruction of Jerusalem? So AD 70, the Romans surrounded Jerusalem, sieged it, killed 1 million plus Jews, and then carried them a couple away. Or is this language talking about Christ coming back to get us? And as you look here, based on verse number 32, the argument I'm making is that this is talking about AD 70. Okay, we'll keep moving. So here's the point, though. Verse number 34. You may disagree with me on that. Please come talk to me, because I would love to hear your thoughts and your studies on that. Verse number 24. Be on guard so that your hearts will not be weighed down with dispensation and drunkenness and the worries of life, and will not come on you suddenly like a trap. For it will come upon all those who dwell on the face of the earth. I think the point of all that Jesus is saying here is the fact that you need to be ready. You need to be prepared. So it doesn't matter if we're talking 80, 70. For those people, they need to be ready for that. If we're talking about the second coming of Christ, we understand we absolutely need to be prepared for that. Okay, so that's chapter 21. We see Jesus toward the end of his ministry teaching in the temple during the day, and at evening would go out to the mount that is called Olives. Okay, 22. Very quickly, Ross is going to be preaching on the Lord's Supper, he told me, sometime soon, so we're skipping over that section. It's interesting to me because in verse 24 through 28, there is an argument about who is the greatest. Perhaps them even arguing among themselves. It makes me think about, James and John and their mother and their quest to be, at Christ's right side. That's where my mind went. Perhaps causing arguments between the apostles. And then we get to the garden. Wanted to spend some time here. We've got 3 minutes. As we get into some application, we see here, obviously, the suffering of Christ. The sweat drops of blood, which only Luke records. This is extreme suffering, but he's victorious in that, as he says, not my will, but your will be done. As we think about application, as we wrap up the class this morning, I want you to think about Peter, James, and John and the fact that Jesus told them to pray lest they not fall into temptation, and none of them did. They all slept. And the question I have for you is, what happens if they would have prayed? Be mindful that Christ just told Peter that he's going to deny him 3 times. Perhaps if Peter spent that time praying, that he would have had more faith, he would have been, this is all hypothetical, but have been prepared in that moment and not sinned against the Lord. You think about James and John arguing about a position and a kingdom that they really don't understand or know anything about, don't understand the cup that Christ is about to drink. Imagine if they spent time praying for their hearts and their mind and for humility, what their attitude would have looked like going forward. And then I ask all of us this morning, what would happen if we prayed more about the temptations and the sins that we struggle with? Because I think an argument can be made, if we would take time praying about those things, we would have more strength in overcoming them. Appreciate you guys being here. That was my last class. Ross is going to wrap it up next week because I won't be here. I was thankful for this opportunity to be here with y'all and to go through this great book. Looking forward to worshiping with you soon.